Hi, my name is Andrea Kupfer-Schneider, Professor of Law and Director of the Institute for Women's Leadership at Marquette University. In honor of the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment, and in recognition of how important women are in this current election, we are delighted to bring you our virtual conference on women's suffrage and innovation. All of our keynote speeches and panel conversations are available on our website. The panel conversation you are about to see was taped live on October 16th. Thank you for joining us.
Welcome everybody to IWL's evening session of InnoVoting, How Democracy is Being Reshaped by Women's Innovation, Innovative Voting, Activism, and Candidacy. Great to see everybody coming in. I'm going to close out the pre-session poll here in a moment, so get your last minute votes in. And with that, I'm going to pass the mic to Kelley Murray.
Hi, welcome to InnoVoting, Action, Engagement, and Change. And I am so excited to welcome you today to what will be a wonderful panel discussion with Dr. Mary Kelley, Dr. Christina Wolbrecht, and Dr. Kara Swanson. My name is Kelley Murray, and I'm a professor at law at Marquette University Law School, and my co-host is, I feel like I should do this, and my co-host is Amber Wichowsky, and I'm going to turn it over to Amber to look at our first theme, which is action.
Wonderful, thanks Kelley, and welcome. So Kelley and I have structured our conversation today around three themes: action and engagement and change. We're going to start off with action, thinking about these last several years, about the ways in which women are participating in democratic life. Do we see change? Do we see continuity? What might be the impacts of their democratic engagement? So my first question here is for Dr. Wolbrecht. Christina, in recent years, we've seen near record or record numbers of women running for office in the United States. And I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit about this shift, and in particular, what impact seeing these sort of like highly visible women running for office, what impact it might have on younger women.
Thanks, Amber. And I just want to say thank you to Marquette. This is a really wonderful event, and I'm really honored to be part of it. And not only because I love my vote necklace so very much. So thank you all so much. You guys win. I've been to a lot of schools this year. You're the winners for sure. So you're absolutely right. We've seen a really substantial growth in women running, particularly since 2018. I guess I'd say a couple of things. This was in 2018 and now again in 20, a really sharp increase. In 2018, as had been the case in most of the growth in women running for political office, was really mostly Democratic women who were running. We're not seeing those same increases on the Republican side. That's a little different in 2020, where we are seeing many more Republican women running. I think you see a couple of things. I think you see a changing context for women candidates, where they're not only accepted, but really welcomed for what they can bring to the political world. I think you see the outcome of a lot of really careful efforts to help women who are interested in running get the resources, the skills, the experience, the confidence that they need to go forward. And so that's mattered a great deal. The parties are doing a lot to recruit women. I think that's been important as well. In my own research with Dave Campbell, we've shown that when women run for office, they do in fact inspire, we look particularly at adolescents, young girls to be more interested in politics, to discuss it more. After 2016, they were more likely to engage in protest. They had the women in their own communities as role models there. This is what you do with your frustration. And this is where I'm particularly excited or interested to see what happens in 2020. We know that Democratic women candidates had a big impact on interest in politics among Democratic girls in 2018. And now that we see more Republican women running, I'm really looking forward to seeing the impact that that has on girls as well.
Wonderful. Professor Kelley, your keynote address, brought to life so many women in the early republic. And I'm wondering, you know, listening to Christina talk about 2020, you know, as a historian, are there historical moments that are, comparables are probably the wrong way to say this, but that we might kind of think back on about just women entering the political fray? Of course, the political fray in those times were quite different than the political fray today, but I'm wondering what impact did these women have on other women in their times?
I think of two moments that I think are critical, one in the 19th century and one much more recently. I'm thinking first about the 1830s and 40s, and I'm thinking about abolitionism. And I'm thinking about the entry of women into abolitionism, which became their entry then that got them to suffrage. And I think particularly of individuals such as Sarah Mapps Douglas, an African-American woman living in Philadelphia, teaching in Philadelphia, who was extremely active and who spoke in various venues, including various literary societies, and who herself formed a literary society of African-American women in Philadelphia and spoke eloquently about the need for women's rights across the board, as well as, you know, for Black women as well as for white women. She was an extraordinary person, and she worked into the 1870s. I think also about Sarah and Angelina Grimke, white Southerners who came from a slaveholding family, who left the South, came north, settled in Philadelphia, and joined the Quaker meeting there. And the ways as Sarah Mapps Douglas was also a member of that Quaker meeting, and the ways in which they also became the first lecturers to go actually to platforms and to begin speaking, and the kind of controversy that they caused. They were told by the congregational ministers, the organized congregational ministers of New England, that they should cease and desist immediately. They did not. I think about individuals like that. Emma Matilda Cassie, who came from a wealthy Baltimore family and who also circulated her albums and garnered support for issues around women's rights in that particular way. All of these women in different venues and in different ways entered public life at that time. And they were important models for those who came after them. The second that I think about is one that's much more recent, and that comes in the 1970s, the 1960s and the 1970s. I think about Shirley Chisholm's election to Congress, and then I think about her presidential run in 1972. I think of all of the kinds of politics that went on that engaged women in those particular years, and also that they turned to politics as a way to change matters throughout their lives. They had as models women such as Bella Abzug and Pat Schroeder. Bella Abzug, a classic New Yorker, and that is a self-description on her part. She was strong, she was talkative, she was in the eyes of many very abrasive. But she did not care. She was there to make her point, and she was exceptionally powerful in Congress. She got things done. And then I also think about Pat Schroeder, who was married and had children. She was the first woman in Congress to do so, and how she was ridiculed and told to go home, told she didn't belong there. And I was reading about her again today. She tells them one time that she felt, you know, maybe they're right. She was from Colorado, and she was flying back to Denver on a plane with some of her children, and suddenly a plain salad, you know, those ones they serve on the plane, went zooming down the aisle in front of her, and she could not catch it. And she thought, no, maybe this is a little much, maybe this is more than I can manage. But she got the salad back, and she kept right on going. So I think about women like that and the kinds of models that they provided for us in both the past as well as in the clearer present. So yes, there are other moments, and they make a very real difference.
Thank you so much, Professor Kelley. I now want to turn to Professor Swanson and ask her this question. The last 4 years have seen the emergence of new claims of social identity, including movements around sexual orientation, like trans citizenship. Do you see movements engaged with sexual orientation using some of the same persuasive claims as to inclusive innovation as made by suffragettes around citizenship?
Thank you, Kelley, for that interesting question, but also just inviting me to participate in this conference. It's really a pleasure to be even virtually at Marquette and to be participating on this panel. It's really a highlight at the end of my week here. As to your question, almost all movements for inclusion, people seeking full legal citizenship, rest on a really basic strategy, right? We're here, and this is how we want you to see us. This is how we want you to understand us, right? The quest for visibility. We're here, and in the course of living our lives, we're contributing to the polity and society in many ways. And there's a very old slogan that's still being used, right? We're here, we're queer, for example, right? See us and see who we are. And it's actually been exciting and interesting to see how in recent years, movements for inclusion have also relied, like the 19th century suffragists, on evidence of innovative contributions as a particularly salient way of showing who we are as we seek inclusion and what our contributions are. So I'm thinking of hashtags, for example, queer in STEM, trans in STEM, bi and sci, right? That come with photos. This see us, see who we are, and also see what we're doing. We're not just making the invisible visible, we're tapping into this powerful way of showing that we're participating in this long tradition of American ingenuity and inventiveness that undergirds these claims to be one of us, to be full Americans that are contributing in material ways to an innovative future and also deserve to have full legal status in the moment.
Thanks, Cara. Do you guys have any like cross questions? We actually have a little bit of time. So I think all of you are making such really neat interlocking points. Do you want to respond? Do any one of you want to respond to another's sort of statement?
I just want to comment that I love how all these perspectives from history, law, and political science, all about sort of the cyclical nature of reform, how we learn from each other, how we're inspired by earlier folks. We know suffrage came out of the abolition movement. We know the second wave came out of the anti-war and the free speech and the civil rights movement. We know that struggles for LGBTQ rights build off of and learn from those, and vice versa. I think you see a lot of learning in more recent movements like the Black Lives Movement that share, as Professor Swanson said, these basic sort of claims about we are citizens, we are fully part of this community, this American community, and we want to be seen. And that struggle, who belongs in the American community, has been absolutely central to our politics from the founding until today. Who is the we of the United States? And we're absolutely having that discussion in 2020 once again.
So,
Kelley?
oh no, Amber. Oh, Carr. Sorry, Professor Swanson. Sorry.
If you want me to talk more, I just wanted to say how when I was listening to Dr. Wolbrecht's presentation and Dr. Kelley's presentation, this theme of visibility was so apparent. This notion that if young girls see women running for Congress, if young girls see women protesting in the streets, that they're more likely to be interested in politics, they're more likely to participate. The incredible impact of having the Grimke sisters be seen on a stage, right? That's all about visibility and where they are and whose eyes are on them from what direction. So that's just a really interesting interlocking theme of all of our research in this area.
Amber, do you have Professor Kelley?
Please call me Mary. So I wanted to also comment on terms of what Cara's had to say, that I use it as a basic text in Women's and Gender History US that I teach, Women's America, which is signal in its reliance upon legal documents. And initially students said, well, why are we reading all of these legal, every week practically they read one legal document another. But when they come away from that course in their evaluations, they see the way in which legal documents, legal precedents, legal cases are the bedrock and the groundwork on which we establish equality in this country. And I think it's one of the most important lessons that they learn in the entire course. So I just want to say how important legal history is as a way in which you can approach women's and gender history in this country.
I just want to say, like, I think one of the real things that our audience might not know is Professor Swanson is both a patent law professor and a history professor, which is why she speaks at this intersection so eloquently. And I think that for me, for all of us here, the idea of visibility, I think, speaks so powerfully to the moments. We were talking in our previous panel about the importance of positive means around women's depiction. And I this week for me, a particularly striking image was actually Kamala Harris speaking to Amy Coney Barrett, and the way they were both, as they sat in that hearing, representing very different views of American femininity, right? And in very different movements, right, that brought them to that particular moment. The civil rights movement, the feminist movement for Kamala Harris, and I think the feminist movement, but also the equally important counter reaction for Amy Coney Barrett, and how those two moments were powerfully speaking to each other in one hearing. So the next set of questions that we have are questions related to engagement. And they are questions about what we can learn about democratic engagement from the relationship of suffrage to innovation. And again, I want to link us back actually to our earlier panel today. Lisa Thurrott spoke powerfully about the idea that suffrage wasn't necessarily at the center of the challenges associated with women's identity. Women were critiquing and engaging in many different types of conversations about being democratic citizen, and suffrage was only one of those, right? And I thought it spoke powerfully to that moment. Professor Kelley, from your presentation, we see women challenging the presumption that they don't belong in public conversation. How did women break through to engage in those public conversations, and what rhetorical strategies did they use, and what impact did they have on prevailing norms and stereotypes about women in public life?
That's a very large question, but I'll try to. Yeah, how about if I make a couple of comments? There are two different strategies, and they follow each other historically. You know you're talking to a historian, obviously. One of them was in the earlier years. One of the strategies was to speak about from the vantage or the standpoint of difference, that women had a particular and different role to play in American life. And this begins with the revolution forward. It begins with the notion that in a republic, women have a particular role to play in influencing members of their family, their sons, their daughters, and their husbands as well. And in doing so, they will shape the republic from the perspective of their central role within the family. That role got extended to the idea of influence in public life more generally, as women stepped beyond their households into public life, and that what their role was to shape that public life, again, as the holders of the essential morality. This, by the way, was a white women's project. It was not an African-American women's project. And it was to say that we are different from, and therefore have this moral responsibility to teach those who are active or more active or have vote in public life how they should hold themselves, how they should perform within public life. That shifted later into another posture, which did not say that we are different. It implied sameness. We are the same. We are basically the same. We all have minds. Our minds are basically the same. We all have the same public responsibilities and the same rights. In other words, it shifted to equality in the later years. And that equality is what kept driving all of these movements from probably, I would say, the progressive reform years of the late 19th century forward. But before that, it was difference that was the driving force in terms of women achieving a higher visibility and a higher level of participation in public life. So there are basically two phases by which women argue for the reasons that they should be engaged in and have equal participation in public life, including suffrage.
This is a quick follow-up question because we actually have a little bit of time.
Mm-hmm.
And how did the Republican theorists address the contradiction of the experience of Native American women or the experience of African American? How did they even think about that set of experiences in relationship to their claims of difference?
No, they did not. This was clearly an exclusively white project, and women who were engaging in it were like many men. They did not necessarily hold egalitarian views toward either Native Americans or toward Africa. It was much more mixed in terms of African Americans, but yes, in terms of Native Americans, they were not part of this project. They were part of getting removed. And that's, in the years I'm talking about, the years of the early 19th century, that was the project. And then in terms of African Americans, it was, you know, removal from slavery, but then what role would they play? Unclear, unclear. And I also want to say one more thing. We always talk about abolition, and well, we should talk about abolition, but what we forget is that an equally important movement in terms of its popularity and the number of people who supported it is the Colonization Society, which argued that the way to solve the issue of slavery in this country was to free, and then on the promise of colonizing and on the promise that they would leave this country and settle in Africa instead. That was a very powerful movement, which tells us a lot about racial perspectives on the part of white people during this period. And we tend to not, it wasn't the success story, fortunately, but it was a very important story that we tend to neglect. And it tells us a lot about perspectives of white people during this period.
Thank you. I have a second question for Professor Swanson. From your presentation, we see a very specific technique, the use of validating innovation to claim that women were prepared to be full citizens. And indeed, in 1809, Mary Keyes, this is part of our poll question, Mary Keyes was the first woman to receive a patent in 1809, and in 1868, Martha Jones was the first African-American woman to receive a patent. And I think notably both moments, one right after the Revolutionary War, one after the Civil War. So these are very important sort of moments of inventiveness. So let's say this was a very successful technique for passage of the 19th Amendment, but was this claim carried forth in successive feminist reform movements, such as the Equal Rights Amendment?
Thank you, Kelley. And I want to start my answer by maybe pushing back a little bit on some of the assumptions of that question. I do argue that women used patents as evidence of their inventive ability as a powerful rhetorical strategy to claim full legal citizenship as part of the suffrage movement of the 19th century. But, and that campaign was successful in that they succeeded in moving the dial, and the dial being starting point, women don't have the capacity, the capability, the ability to invent anything. They can only imitate, they can't originate things. Two, the woman inventor being a recognized status, that there are women that are inventing, that inventing is something that you could aspire to, a way of earning money, that it was, you know, it's mentioned in women's sort of self-help manuals. So successful in that way. But I'm not claiming that that achievement, convincing people that women could invent, was sufficient, of course, to get them the vote, to get them the 19th Amendment. The women thought it was necessary, that it was a very important step to overcome this idea that they were not original thinkers, but it certainly wasn't sufficient. So, and then I want to also sort of reposition the second part of your question. We all know, of course, the Equal Rights Amendment movement has not yet been successful. I'm going to put it that way. But of course, there were also a lot of legal successes during that period of feminist activism, right? The inclusion of sex in the Civil Rights Act, all kinds of judicial victories, both in reproductive areas and employment areas. And I do see women of the second half of the 20th century making these claims again, that women are innovators. So again, they're not sufficient, but they're seen as important. So this idea, for example, that a woman is the inventor of the cotton gin, not Eli Whitney, that's credited to Catherine Green, shows up again in feminist newspapers and magazine articles in the 1970s. And what I also find very interesting is today, the focus has been more and more from the women's movement to, and this goes back to Dr. Wolbrecht's first point about the the value of modeling behavior for children, the focus has really been on teaching girls that they can be innovators, to show them that girls can invent in order to change the pipeline in STEM. And I think that really comes from an awareness of the jobs and the money that are associated with STEM, as well as the social and political capital that comes along with achievements in STEM.
So, however, you note in your presentation that the gender gap in patent endures, right? And limits, it has potential limits on our growth and innovation. How might we think about the connection between this gender gaps and gender gaps in politics?
Well, I think that's a very interesting question. And for those of you who don't have my presentation at the tips of your fingers, women get 10 to 12% of patents issued today as we sit here. Now, I say this is not a gap in patents, this is a chasm in patents between the sexes, really, and it's absolutely astonishing to me, given my experiences in my lifetime as somebody trained in science and patent law. So what I think about when I think about that is back to something you said a few minutes ago, Kelley, which is, of course, the suffrage movement didn't start as a suffrage movement. It started as a movement for equality, and equality in every single realm: politics, society, employment, religion. And we have seen, of course, that the 19th Amendment was eventually passed and ratified after a heck of a lot of effort. But that was only a small victory. And what the patent statistics tell me is that we're still in that fight. The fight is absolutely not over. And so the patents, to me, become a proxy of the failure to achieve full equality, even though we've achieved equality in certain areas.
I'm going to turn it over now to Amber, but Carrie's in the chat is asking a ton of really good questions. And indeed, one of her questions about the failure of the ERA previews my question to Cara in the next section. So I might loop back and pull her wonderful questions in the chat function in. But before I do that, let me turn it over to Amber.
Yeah, this is great. I mean, I'm hoping that some of our attendees have been able to watch our first live event from today at noon, but if not, we're recording these, and so to be able to make them, there's so many connections, not only for our panelists here, but even thinking back to the first session that we had at noon, where we were really reflecting on the fact that voting, we can't see voting as the end-all be-all, that the sort of story here, we're kind of, celebrating the centennial of the ratification of the 19th Amendment. But when we're talking about broader gender equality, social equality, economic, political, it's a much bigger story, and it gets narrowed if we just focus on obtaining the sort of right to vote. And so, Christina, I was really struck in your first presentation when you were talking about the ways in which women had to innovate new forms of political action, because they're shut out of formal partisan politics. So if you're thinking about, that petitioning, lobbying, protesting, right, in front of the White House. And you also make this point so clearly that, the woman voter, it's a myth. This idea that women, they're diverse in their identities, their interests, their experiences. And so, today women, we're not shut out of formal politics in that same way, but we remain underrepresented, in the halls of power, in Congress, in state legislatures, in mayor's offices. Cara is telling us, about the chasm for the gender gap here in patents. And I'm thinking about just, today, the recession, we're hearing the phrase she-cession in terms of the disproportionate impact on women. And so our moment has all of these kind of contradictions and challenges. We have women who are really exerting a real intersectional identity, right? It's Black women, it's white conservative women. So I'm wondering, this is very long-winded setup here, I apologize, but I'm wondering, do we see this sort of could we say that we're seeing innovations in political activism today, rhetorical strategies, things that are kind of challenging some of our gender stereotypes, opening up maybe new pathways for democratic engagement, you know, in the sort of struggle for broader equality? How can we make sense of, I guess, this theme of innovation in today's kind of political environment?
So I just want to agree that I think this conversation just touches on so many important things. And I want to thank Dr. Swanson, since I'm going to finish this up and sit down to dinner with my 2 teen daughters. And we're going to talk about only 10% of the patents belonging to women. I had no idea. That's so fascinating. And I think it really connects with the political world in a couple of ways. I'm writing notes to myself. I want to highlight. So I want to talk about 3 things, Amber, that you were raised in your comments, and I'm going to try and do them quickly. The first is that to think a little bit about innovation in the suffrage movement. 19th century politics was party politics through and through. Our last period of really strong partisan identification of the kind of identity politics, which we frankly also always see, but the sort of lining up of identities, religious, racial, et cetera, with party identities, happened in the second half of the 19th century. This was a problem for women because the way in which you made political change is that you organized groups of voters through political parties and you negotiated for policy outcomes through this party structure. But of course, women couldn't do that. They couldn't, you know, show up and hand out shots of whiskey or dollar bills or whatever it was to organize voters in the same way. And so they had to come up with different ways of making political change. And what they did is they tried to affect public opinion through rallies and speeches. They drew attention to their issues through innovative protest activities. Women were, in fact, the very first people to ever protest in front of the White House, as was done by Alice Paul and others. They went directly to legislators and instead of working to get them elected, made arguments on their merits, or as Corinne McConaughey has shown, said, look, we are allied with all these other people you do care about. You care about the farmers and the Grange, and you care about this third party movement that's threatening you, and so you should listen to us. The irony, of course, is that a lot of other interests looked around and said, that seems to work better. That's easier than a really big party machine structure where we can count all the votes and sort of things. And so by the time women actually got the ballot, as some theorists have pointed out, it was in some sense worth less than it had been in the 19th century, because the interest all figured out, oh, we're going to do public opinion stuff. We're going to do direct lobbying. The organizing of votes won't be as important. So absolutely women as innovators in the 19th century, part 1. Part 2, I'm really interested in seeing how, as we see more women candidates and we see more men candidates, sort of reinventing campaigning and campaign strategies. So my students in my classes, my women in politics classes, do candidate reports that they look at sort of gender in the cabinet, and I start every class with what I call a moment of gender, where we look at ads by male and female candidates and how they're sort of using gender. And what I've learned from my students is that male candidates are filling their Instagrams with pictures of them with their family and their dog and their other sorts of aspects. They're giving us a different vision of what male leadership looks like. And then we have women candidates like Teach Out, who's doing an ad where she's getting an ultrasound. 2 women in 2018 did ads while they were breastfeeding, right? They're all sort of challenging ideas about what leadership looks like. You know, AOC is making soup while she talks about public policy. These are all sort of innovations that everybody, you know, is having to think about, and they complicate our ideas of gender and leadership. And then finally, in terms of innovation, I think one of the points everyone has raised, people who study American political development by like the great Julia Azari in your own at Marquette will tell you that, you know, things follow on different tracks. So you can totally transform politics by saying women are full citizens and they can vote, as they did in the 19th century. Of course, Jim Crow made that a problem for lots of women of color, of course. But that doesn't say we're no longer going to have a patriarchal family structure. That doesn't say we're now going to have women with the same levels of education. And the patriarchal family structure is a big part of that. If men are still the leaders in their families, then they're still sort of representing the family in the public sphere, and that has consequences for women's political engagement. It also means if the family can only afford one poll tax, they're only going to pay for the husband to vote as well. So it's absolutely the case that we can advance and fall back in different areas, but that those advances and fallbacks are going to affect other places as well.
So this serves as a really nice entrance into our last set of questions, and then we'll be taking the questions that we see in the chat from the that talk about a little bit more about current issues around executive orders, as well as the failures of the ERA to sufficiently account for class and race. But how has the changing landscape around voting created new social disruption, right? So in here, I'm going to start off with a question directed to Cara. A key debate in the current election is the tension between old voting, right, which is that you show up at a specific place at a specific time and you are a real voter, right, as opposed to new voting, right? The citizen chooses when and where to vote in the months, right, up to the election, right? For many states, we've just had the opening of early voting. Will these shifting technologies of voting shape new rhetorical forms of citizenship? And that's directed towards Cara.
Thank you, Kelley. That's a really provocative question. This shifting landscape of voting as a technology, and also the technologies of voting, right, which is, and I can just set that one to the side, is so interesting on so many levels, right? And the whole debate that we're having about how and when and where to vote, my early voting starts tomorrow, and I know this, during this pandemic, right, is refocusing our attention on the limits of our constitutional guarantee to vote, right? The limits that allow the wide disparities in ease of voting between states and among communities in a single state, like in Wisconsin in the primary election, right? And of course, we're also in this conversation about how and when and where to vote. We're being reminded of voting as this core duty as well as a right of citizenship, right? And the fact that, of course, people fought hard for this right over and over and over again in US history. So there's definitely shifts, but I have to confess that my crystal ball is a little bit murky about whether and how these new technologies of voting might shape rhetorical forms of citizenship. And this is how I thought about that as I looked into my murky crystal ball, right? Old voting was very visible and communal. And I have just very vivid memories of going with my mom to the polls as a kid as she voted in Racine, Wisconsin. And in recent years, I have had the luxury of, I get to walk to my polling place in my neighborhood. I see my neighbors, I see my neighbors' homes, I see familiar faces in line. And it was an act of belonging. And there's often a lot of joy in my neighborhood on voting day. I voted early in the primary, and that did not feel as communal and visible. And of course, voting by mail is much more individual. On the other hand, of course, right, new voting makes it easier for more people to vote, and increasing the opportunity for more people to vote and take part in the substantive act opens the doors to rethinking, as you said, the rhetorics of citizenship around voting, and the loss of public ritual as a small price to pay for that, right? If we can open the door more widely. So what I would like to see, I don't know if we will see it though, is new rhetorical forms of citizenship that claim voting very much as a foundational, basic, widespread right and privilege, something that maybe we all do the same way, like we always just renew our driver's licenses. But also to think about how we can shape and claim and tell stories about its community building role, even if we're not doing it all at the same time and all in the same place. And I'm sure Dr. Wolbrecht has some thoughts about this, but of course we see that shift to social media, right? Where you post the picture of the I voted sticker, or you post the picture of you putting the ballot in the drop box, right? That's our new public space. But this is again, that public space is not the same as my block. and my neighbors who I am voting for my local officials together with, right? It's a larger space, so that's an interesting tension there, I think.
Can I actually take her up on a quick two fingers on that? I agree, and absolutely, and I think this is so important. I want to make one historical point. Voting in the 19th century was this very different sort of process. It mostly took place in saloons and bars and public spaces. And it was an incredibly masculine activity. There was, veterans would march around like soldiers. There'd be, a drum group. There'd be all this sort of masculine space, and people would be really, really drunk. That would be part of it as well. And so, one of the reasons that people in the 19th century found the idea of women's suffrage so outrageous is that no good and honorable woman would go down to a voting place like that, right? It was a very male, militaristic space, and so. One of the lessons, I think, is that how we vote says a lot about who is welcome to vote. And I think that's really important. I want to agree also with Kara. We actually know that at least our early studies of early voting didn't actually have a huge impact on turnout, because it turns out that voting is a social act. The word ritual is exactly right. We affirm that we are citizens and that we have a voice in who our leaders are. And until this year, I was always I go on election day, I go in public, I thank the poll workers, right? I'd rather do that. And I'm from Oregon, where you can vote by mail forever. And so we know that these things make it different. I am intrigued, as Kara said, about the way in which social media is changing that, right? So if everyone goes to vote, it means that your neighbor reminds you to go vote. It means that at the breakfast table, your partner says, oh, remember, we got to stop and vote today. And that's not going to happen when we vote over a long period of time, except for, and I will acknowledge that my social circles are a little unusual and focused on elections, right? Now people do post, I early voted, I did these things, right? I'm reminded every day that early voting is happening in Indiana. I meant to go this morning. I learned on social media that Mayor Pete went this morning here in South Bend, and I didn't get to go with him. But I am curious, this question about innovation and technology, and the other piece I'll put is, as more barriers have been put up to voting now as an act of resistance. Not just, I'm going to show up because that's what good, dutiful people do. And we know duty is a big part of why people vote, but just the showing up is a political statement that I think may affect our voting as well. That was more than two fingers, I'm sorry.
Oh, it's great.
In the last few minutes, we talked a lot about social media. And I think that in reference to an earlier question of what are the political strategies, what are the methods of persuasion, that social media has become one of the critical areas in which we now make opinion, in which we now try to persuade people. And it's absolutely crucial that people have access to social media and that they use it, as you pointed out, all throughout these particular stages. That's become a major forum.
I'm going to turn it over to Amber.
Yeah, so Christina, I'm also going to ask you to look in your crystal ball here. I think we're really pivoting to the 2020 election. This week we've been watching the nomination hearings, right, for Judge Amy Coney Barrett, her nomination, to the Supreme Court. White women, in your presentation have tended to support the Republican Party in recent cycles, and there's some evidence that in 2016. That Trump drew support of many white women without college degrees in particular. And yet the 2020 race is shaping up for a possibly historic gender gap. So Biden's lead among women in public opinion polls is about twice as large as Clinton's was in 2016. And President Trump's certainly trying to use Barrett's nomination to give his campaign a boost among women. I'm wondering what your take on her nomination is. Will it have any impact on the gender gap come election day? Do you expect, are these polls wrong? Are they overstating, do you think, the size of the gender gap? Are we paying too much attention to it? I'm wondering what your take is on really this past week of politics.
Yes, lots of South Bend people in the national news this year. So let me start with this. In 2016, there were a lot of expectations in the press that there would be an enormous gender gap. We had the first woman candidate on one side. We had a candidate who said misogynistic things about women and was credibly accused of doing misogynistic things by women. And so obviously we would have a huge gender gap. And the truth is that the gender gap in 2016 was in no way historic. It was very much in keeping with what the gender gap had looked like. I'll say two things about that. One is that's a reminder that women do not vote exclusively as women, and that the same racial identities, class identities, et cetera, that shape men's votes, shape women's votes as well. And that is why, while the gender gap looked exactly the same, really, and the percentage of women voting Republican in 2016 was not very different from 2012, when the most radical thing about women that Mitt Romney said was that there were binders full of them. Also, however, masks some important difference. So the level of women overall stayed the same. But if you actually look at white women, as you just suggested, white women with college degrees became much less likely to vote Republican, and white women without college degrees became much more likely to vote Republican, even more so than white men without college degrees. So newspapers, stop interviewing the men in diners, interview the waitresses. That's where the interesting stuff is happening. What does that mean for 2020? Well, it means that Trump would like to win back some of those white women with a college degree, and he needs to keep those white women without a college degree. He has clearly, in his rhetoric, given up on doing anything with Black women. He just isn't even trying, and in fact, I think is actively, in some of his statements, working to sort of push them away. I don't think that the Barrett nomination is going to make a big difference in that, right? It's certainly not the case that any women voters get really excited when you just put more women on your team. And we know that about vice presidents, we know that about lots of things. However, we do know that what motivates most of the gender gap are economic concerns about the size of government and what government does. And this last 4 years has really had a huge impact on women in general, as Amber just said, and their economic conditions, particularly for women without a college degree who are in the front lines and have suffered enormously in the economic downturn of this pandemic. So what I will be watching in all of the exit polls and whatever data I can get a hold of after the election will be how Donald Trump is doing with white women that are lower on the socioeconomic status, and what that looks like among college educated women as well, because I think that's really going to be key for him.
My students who may be watching this right now or watching the recording will be very happy to hear your answer. In fact, I have a student who's digging into some of the Marquette Law School poll data to try to unpack the ways in which women and their sort of preferences as we head into the November 3rd election. I guess before we open it up, we've got some questions in the chat. I'm sure panelists might have questions for one another as well. I wanted to close the sort of formal session here with a question for Mary. You know, I've just been reflecting on just like all the contradictions about women in politics in our contemporary moment. We've got more women running for office, they're leading grassroots movements, you know, but political, gender gaps in political representation remain. Many gender stereotypes endure. Women continue to express less political advocacy than men. So in some sense, and of course with Professor Swanson telling us about, other sorts of gender gaps or chasms that are really alarming. So we're seeing change, but some continuity as well. So I guess I'm going to close by bringing us a little full circle. In your keynote for our conference, you discussed the importance of education for women's political empowerment. And I'm wondering what you might say is what role you think education can or should play today to empower women as political actors.
Yes, I'd be glad to speak to that for a moment or two. But I wondered if I could also add on to what was said previously about Coney Barrett and what effect she might have. I think the effect that she might have has a great deal to do with where you stand on choice. Because if you stand in favor of choice, Coney Barrett does not, from her record at least, although she obviously would not say anything about that in the hearing itself, her record is that she is not pro-choice. And that may affect how you're going to consider her nomination and Trump as well. On the other hand, if you're deeply engaged as she is in being anti-choice, then that will also have an impact, I think, on how you look upon this whole process. So she's a key figure. And I think it's we would be remiss if we do not continue to look at the issue of choice as being a crucial one in our politics today, and one that affects how we vote, how we participate, how we see ourselves as members of a larger political community. In terms of where we stand today, and I think that women's participation is absolutely crucial. I think it will continue. I think that women more and more feel themselves at every possible level to be engaged citizens. And I see that for us, that for me anyway, what's crucial, we always look at the levels that are higher. We don't look so much at, excuse me. We don't look as much at levels such as the mayors and local office holding and state office holding. That's where I think women begin to participate. It's where they get their learning and their training to go on to other parts of political participation. And I see more and more women doing that and seeing that as part of their lives. And I also see women who marry and who have children seeing themselves as entering public life as well. I think it's crucial that the kind of model that someone like Pat Schroeder made in the 1980s, and she got a lot of, blowback for it, is now becoming more and more possible and visible for women. So I see, I'm not a Pollyanna. I'm not going to say that the next years are going to be all glory for women, but I do see very real possibilities that we can pursue, and we definitely, I hope we do pursue. Does that answer your question?
I think it answers it quite well, and it leads us nicely into our Q&A, which has like an Andrea is actually going to jump in here. Andrea, because my Zoom is not working the way it should. I've only seen two of the questions that Carrie's asked, but not the other two Q&A questions. So Andrea's going to jump in, and how ideal is that to have her end what has been a magnificent symposium, and we're so excited for her leadership at IWL. It's been an honor to work with you on this. So I'll turn it over to you, Andrea.
Well, thank you, Kelley, and I really hope my mom hears this. First question in the Q&A is, and actually, Christina, both you and, well, all three of you really gave examples of how women have innovated in their activism for the vote and for rights and for inclusion. And so have women, either by nature or by necessity, been more creative in their methods in terms of trying to get their rights?
Well, I'll simply say they had no choice but to be more creative and to craft new and different ways in which they could participate, because the old road, the road traveled by white men, was not one that was particularly open to them. It was a closed road. So they needed to develop new strategies, new techniques, new ways to reach other women, new ways to demonstrate that they were fully capable and competent to participate fully as public citizens. So that would be my immediate response. And then perhaps someone else would like to take on some of the innovations that they actually did.
I wouldn't want to say the most creative because lots of movements have had incredible innovations around the world. I'm thinking some of the great innovations in the LGBTQ communities, activism as well. I just would agree with Mary. There was no choice, and particularly when it comes to politics, this idea that women are inherently not political and that their arena is just not in politics is an extremely old one that is deeply embedded into the American political system, and in fact, Western philosophy in general. And so for women to act political, just to act political, is radical in ways. So if they just showed up and did what men did, it looked outrageous, right? And so the cartoons that show if women get the right to vote, they always showed men having to hold crying babies and do the laundry, right? This was a challenge to the very structure of masculinity. And so I think that alone meant things that we would think pretty normal now, like wearing pants, become really creative and radical acts. That's especially complicated for Black women. And I think that's why we've seen so much innovation recently of Black women, of just countering, in the same way that women in general had to counter these gender stereotypes, Black women have to counter these intersectional stereotypes. And in doing so, I mean, I think it's important to say that Black women have the highest rate of turnout in the United States, you know, have really pioneered in important ways as well. And that's sort of the intersectional argument, that those who face the most sort of dimensions of oppression understand oppression in a way that other groups do not, and therefore can sort of pioneer activism around it.
There's a good question in the chat that it makes sense to actually pull off of this on intersectionality in particular. And Kelley, you had mentioned this earlier, that the ERA failed because it did not take into account class and race. And so what have we learned from this in order to ensure equality for all women?
I can say one thing that we hadn't learned, right? If you say that that movement failed because it failed to consider class and race, that was the same mistake that white suffrage leaders were making in the late 19th century and early 20th century, right? They were not being inclusive. They were taking race into account, and the way that they were taking into account was to pander to the white supremacist beliefs of the men in power, who were the people who were voting on the 19th Amendment and ratifying the 19th Amendment in state legislatures. So we can say we think we have learned, but history also has some repetitive aspects as well.
I was personally encouraged by the Me Too movement, which, again, imperfect in lots of ways. But the story is really that when a famous child actor talked about Me Too and was called out, right, because that phrase came originally from Black woman activist Tamara Burke, that she sort of stepped back and said, that's right. And that the movement, the Hollywood ACT UP movement, stood up for women in doing farm work. They included in their claims requests for sort of diversity in the, you know, the non-stars on their sets, and sort of equal pay and those sorts of things there. We're nowhere close to where we need to be in terms of seeing race, class, and sexuality and gender all as one, you know, kinds of oppression that need to be fought jointly. But I think there's increasing recognition, and it's been exciting to see that this year of the suffrage centennial, where there has been so much talk about the shortcomings of the suffrage movement, the ways in which it was explicitly racist, the ways in which the 19th Amendment did not overcome Jim Crow and the barriers that Black women faced to voting. Again, not perfectly, but I have been encouraged to see greater recognition of those dynamics.
Oh, Christina, that was just, it's a great way to kind of bring us full circle in so many ways for this conference. We're actually at the end of our hour here and drawing to a close. And I just want to thank Professors Kelley, Swanson, and Wolbrecht, who've been just so available for this conference. This was not the conference that we had originally planned. We thought we would all be in Milwaukee, that we would be coming off of having the DNC in our city, and that we had grand plans, and we had to pivot because of COVID. And the three of you recorded, you know, you've now been available for multiple Zoom sessions and conversations, and we're just so appreciative of the time that you've given. And I will also say, not all of the women and men who've been working on this conference are actually kind of behind the scenes here in our Zoom session, but it's also just been a real highlight for me personally this year to just work with this wonderful group to put this conference together, and to our IWL director, Professor Andrea Schneider in particular, for the vote necklaces as well that made their way into our mailboxes. We're so appreciative. So thank you again, and thank you for our attendees for joining us on our last session for our conference this year. Thank you.
Can I thank you, please? You have been absolutely wonderful. It has been, as I said at the beginning of my own presentation, it's a signal honor to have delivered this keynote, and just as much an honor to have participated in the rest of these activities that we have done together. You have truly made community, and that is, in this pandemic, there's nothing that's more valuable than the example of making community. And you have provided us an exceptional example. I shall not forget this. And so I thank you.
I agree with Mary.
We could gift now. We could totally gift now.
Thank you all for joining us.
Thank you. This officially concludes this session of the webinar. Please fill out our survey, check out the website for more resources, both on voting and on teaching resources, and so much more. We'd love your feedback and appreciate your participation. Have a wonderful weekend, everybody.
Thank you.
On behalf of the entire Planning Committee, I'd like to thank you for joining us today. Please check out the other segments of our conference on our website. And please do let us know how you utilized the resources provided. Our feedback form and email address are also located on our website. We'd love to hear from you. And of course, remember to vote.